So I wanted to talk about some of the major issues with the Superman movie. And even though I enjoyed the overall film and would rate this a 7 out of 10, I still think there are a lot of minor things with this film that could have been easily improved that wouldn't necessarily have required too much of a drastic change, whether it be in the production or the overall plot. And just as a disclaimer, this is of course going to get into some spoilers for the film. So really, to get started, the first problem I have out of 8 for this video is the close-up shots of Superman flying, kind of similar to a fisheye lens. Even though this was just a few seconds in the film, I think this was even worse, especially considering the marketing for the movie, because I think this quick little glimpse of Superman was something that really kind of hurt the perception of quality when it came to this film. Again, even though this was just a part of the beginning sequence, I think it not only should have been cut out of any trailers, but should have just been cut out of the film entirely. I think you would have been fine just trimming that out or even trying a different angle. And I don't think this would have been too hard of a fix because this was a green screen shot. It wasn't shot on location or anything like that. So it easily could have been adapted in post. You could have just stuck with the perspective of him from behind, or maybe had the camera from underneath him, or even just tried to get a more accurate facial expression because it didn't really seem to match the action of the scene. But going more into some of the plot points for this movie, I think one of the other early mistakes in this film was some of the context given in the argument between Lois and Clark or Superman. And I really think this pertains to the social media references. I do think everything else was fine about this conversation, such as Lois challenging him about his involvement in international relations or really getting into the nature of these more nuanced topics in terms of Superman's decisions and how they can be challenged from certain points of view. And I thought that was particularly interesting, and I really didn't have a problem with Superman getting a little bit flustered or overwhelmed by some of those questions, since he is still so new to all of this. But I think the part that really took me out of it was the social media stuff that Lois mentioned at the end about different hashtags and stuff like that for Superman, and that seemed to really be the final straw in that conversation and what really drove Superman over the edge. And I thought that was just completely unrealistic and kind of unnecessary to that conversation. I think that bit could have just been cut out of the scene or the dialogue completely, because it seemed like too much of a forced reference to connect this to the modern age with social media and everything like that. But it just felt so unnatural for the scene and also Superman's character. But going to the next major problem, and I think this obviously is the biggest criticism by far of the film, I think the whole plot point of Superman's parents having a more problematic message that they sent to Clark along with his arrival to Earth wasn't really the right direction for this film. I do think it is a big risk, and sometimes those are necessary, especially for the case of a new reboot of a franchise. But looking at what this really served for the plot, I think you could have accomplished the public turning on Superman in a different way. For instance, I think you could have done the same thing by Superman's involvement in a fictional country causing some sort of a retaliation besides just the hammer coming to attack Superman. Maybe if it caused some sort of military retaliation against the US, and Superman was the catalyst for doing that. I think that could have maybe caused a drastic shift in public opinion on Superman and really would have caused the government to question their control over Superman if he's just acting as a sole entity in some of these international affairs. And I think that much better could have connected with the argument between Lois and Superman in the beginning of the movie. And I think Lex would have still been able to easily manipulate that whole situation since he was working behind the scenes with the leader of that country. But going on to the next little minor segment you had of the monkeys in prison, I thought that was also unnecessary, similar to the social media references. And I really think that this just seemed kind of silly. I thought you got enough of the media really turning on Superman by showing the news headlines and some of the other interviews and different segments of the public really turning on Superman. I thought that got the point across fine, and I didn't think you needed to specifically show that Lex had these monkeys really creating all of this public uproar for Superman online. I think, again, this could have just been cut out of the film entirely because it didn't really drive the plot forward in any way. It could have just been left as a deleted scene, or there could have just been a better way of showing this if you really did want to go the extra mile and show that Lex was the one behind even some of the early criticisms of Superman online. I think you could have just shown that through some sort of software that Lex had in his office, or maybe if some of his interns were doing that on their computer. I think that would have been a much more appropriate example of that than having these monkeys in the Pocket universe. But going into, I would say this was probably the next biggest problem with the film, besides the parents' plot point, is that I think you have too much explanatory dialogue that almost seemed to kind of break the fourth wall in terms of just using that dialogue to explain a character's intentions in the film. And I thought the worst example of this was Lex having to discuss out loud for basically no reason why he can't stand Superman. I think that was pretty obvious and you didn't need those couple of lines. But if you did really want to emphasize this even further, I think it could have been done in a different way. Obviously, show don't tell is the rule of thumb for doing this. So I think you could have just done something as simple as having Lex in his office reading the newspaper and seeing Superman as the headline with his own business being pushed to page 5 or something like that. And then he throws it away and discussed an aspect like that could have easily shown his character's intentions, or maybe a little bit more contemplating could have been done on creating a deeper meaning behind some of his cruel intentions for Superman in this. But now going to the end of the film, I thought another minor issue was the Supergirl cameo. I also didn't think this really matched the whole tone of the movie and kind of ruined the dynamic of the Fortress of Solitude. And I think seeing her come to visit Superman there was a little bit unnecessary. And especially getting into Superman having to explain that she goes to other planets with red suns to party were just kind of odd. I do know that this is important to her character since she deals with a lot of trauma, but I thought this kind of just felt like a forced tie-in to obviously the Supergirl movie, which is going to come next for the DCU. And that was, of course, the ambition behind including this in the film. But I also would say at large, I would question the direction of doing a Supergirl movie as the next major project in the DCU. And I think a much better choice would be establishing Wonder Woman in this universe first, and then doing more of a Supergirl spinoff later on after you've really established the early phases of the DCU. And then right after that, I think you also had a little bit of a mismatch with the end credit song. Even though this is a minor detail, I think it is still important because it's really what leaves your lasting impression of the movie. And I I just thought that the song choice really felt out of place here. I do know that James Gunn is a big punk rock person, so he really wanted to add a little bit of personality to the film. And I think that obviously is appropriate and understandable, but I thought that the particular song choice just wasn't right for the whole movie. I don't think the reference to the punk rock poster and the little thing in common that Lois and Clark have in common in terms of the punk rock upbringing was really enough to include this in the final scene and when the credits roll, because I think that this particular song choice just felt like the end of a movie that really took place in high school or something like that. So I think you could have maybe found a more appropriate song choice. I would say another example is looking at, even though this wasn't the end credit song, but looking at Matt Reeves' choice of Something in the Way for Batman obviously was a little bit out there in including that song choice for that movie, but the whole aesthetic of that song choice I think really matched the tone a little bit better. But obviously if you weren't able to do that, I think just going with the original Superman theme or the more modern guitar version of the theme would have been a better choice here. And then going to the final thing, I think it was a crucial mistake not to have an end credit scene that really sparked curiosity for the future of the DCU, because I really think that that's so crucial to establish early on with this new franchise. And I thought both of the end credit scenes that we were given were pointless. You had a neat visual of Superman and Krypto on the moon looking at Earth. And then you also had a choking aftermath scene of Superman and Mr. Terrific. And maybe a consideration was made not to make this feel like the MCU, but I do think that end credit scenes can be just applied to the whole superhero genre in general, and I don't think it would have came across as being too similar to that. But those are really my biggest criticisms with the movie. I thought besides a lot of these things that there was a lot of interesting elements, and I thought that the overall feel of this new universe was excellent, and I'm interested to see more of what's to come with the DCU. But feel free to let me know your thoughts on this, and I'll see you later.